In this video, I'm going to show you how to find the inverse of a linear function. So here we're given the function f of x equals 2x plus 1, and we want to find the inverse function, f inverse of x. First of all, why don't we write this original function using x and y notation? So with y equal to f of x, we can write that y equals 2x plus 1. That's just the definition of our function. Okay, so what if we want to change this up so that y is now f inverse of x? What do we have to change in our function definition here? Well, remember that the inverse function just swaps the outputs and inputs of the original function. So that amounts to just swapping x and y in this original equation. So instead of y equals 2x plus 1, we'll have x equals 2y plus 1. And now that we've swapped x and y is now the output of the inverse function. So now we can find the rule for the inverse function just by solving for y here in this equation. So let's go ahead and do that. We want to get y alone, so let's go ahead and subtract 1 from both sides of the equation. Subtract 1, that'll cancel that plus 1 there. We just get x minus 1 equals 2y. And then get rid of that 2 that's multiplying the y, so divide by 2 over 2 on both sides. I'll cancel this out, and we just have x minus 1 over 2 equals y. So this here, x minus 1 over 2, is the rule for our inverse function. So putting that together, we have that f inverse of x is equal to x minus 1 over 2. Why don't we go ahead and double check this answer as well? So the first thing we want to check is that f of f inverse of x is equal to x. So we want this to be true, but we don't know if it's true just yet because we have to actually check it with the result that we got for the inverse function. So we can just go ahead and plug in f inverse of x for the rule for f of x. So that's just 2 times the input plus 1. So this becomes 2 times the input f inverse of x, then plus 1. And f inverse of x is right over here. That's x minus 1 over 2. So we have 2 times x minus 1 over 2, then plus 1. And hey, this 2 over 2, that cancels out here. And we've just got x minus 1, then plus 1. So the minus 1 and the plus 1, these cancel as well. And we're left with just x. And indeed, that works out. X equals x, so we're good. But we should also check the other way. We should check that f inverse of f of x is also equal to x. So let's check to see if this is true. Just plugging in f of x into the rule for f inverse, that says take the input, subtract 1, and then divide by 2. So take that input f of x, subtract 1, divide by 2, and then plugging in what we know that f of x is, that's just 2x plus 1. We have 2x plus 1, then minus 1, then all over 2. So this plus 1 minus 1 cancels, and then 2x over 2 is just x. And x, indeed, is equal to x. So great, our inverse function is the true inverse function. We can be absolutely sure of it. Here's another problem. We're given the function f of x equals 4 minus 5x, and we want to find the inverse function f inverse of x. And this is going to be very similar to the previous problem. We'll start it off by just writing that y equals f of x. Let's define y this way. And then, according to that definition for y, we have y equals that rule for f of x, 4 minus 5x. Now suppose we want to change this up and say that y equals f inverse of x. What do we have to do to this equation? Well, we just have to swap x and y. So we'll write that x equals 4 minus 5y. So now it just remains to solve for y to figure out what f inverse of x is. So let's go ahead and do that here. So we need to get y alone. Why don't we start by getting rid of that 4? So we'll go ahead and subtract 4 from both sides. And the result then is x minus 4 on the left-hand side. And then 4 minus 4 cancels, and we've just got negative 5y on the right-hand side. Alright, so now we want to get rid of this negative 5 in front of the y. Why don't we think about just getting rid of the negative sign first? Let's go ahead and multiply by negative 1. So times negative 1 on both sides. and the result there. That just flips the sign of each of these terms. So we've got a negative x, and then plus 4 is equal to 5y. Just so it's a little bit cleaner, why don't we flip around this left-hand side, write it as 4 minus x. Oh, it's a little bit simpler. So that's equal to 5y. And then how do we get the 5 off of the y? Well, just divide by 5. Got to do that on both sides. So that cancels the 5 on the y, and then we've just got 4 minus x over 5 equals y. So this right here tells us what the inverse is. That's the rule for the inverse, f inverse of x. Let's go ahead and write that down. F inverse of x is equal to 4 minus x over 5. And do you remember the two things that you should check to be absolutely sure you found the correct inverse? Let's go ahead and write them down. You should check that, first of all, f of f inverse of x is equal to x, and also that f inverse of f of x is equal to x. So f and f inverse should basically cancel each other out. But you'd need to verify that with the actual definition that you found for f inverse. Now we won't actually go through the work to verify these here because we've done a similar process in the previous problem, but I encourage you to double check both of these cases. I assure you they'll both work out. So now we know how to find the inverse of a linear function. And in the future we'll continue learning about functions, such as the behavior of functions.